This question has to do with the nature of the law and the Christian. And there are some who object regarding a Christian approach to the new covenant, which means that the new covenant is new and the old covenant is old, and the old covenant doesn't apply anymore. That the response is that the Christian should continue to follow in the law because passages like Psalms 119, 152, and 160 are two verses in that long psalm that both indicate that God's law is eternal. So how do you respond to that? Well, there's actually a couple of directions one could go. Here's the first thought. The first is that my understanding, I could be mistaken on this, but I'm just drawing from general recollection, is that in the Hebrew there is no term for eternity. And instead, what the Hebrews would say literally is to the end of the age. And so forever means just to the end of the age. Now, this might suggest that God's laws have an application for the full period of time that they were intended, the age, as it were, that God intended them to apply. So that's one possibility, and you may want to pursue that as a possibility. It's not the strongest argument; it's just a thought. The two other arguments I think are more compelling. The first of those two is that even if the law is eternal, it is only eternal for the application for which it was intended originally. Let's just say the laws of California are eternal. Well, if you're living in Illinois, then the laws of California, even if they are eternal, don't apply to you. You don't fall underneath that law. And so it just is moot how long the law applies for. By the same token, if in the New Testament the Christian does not fall under, whether Jewish or Gentile, the Christian does not fall under the Old Testament law, the Mosaic covenant, then regardless of how long the Mosaic covenant exists and applies for those to whom it applies, it doesn't apply at all to those that are outside of its scope. And that would certainly be true of Gentiles even in the Old Testament period of time, as far as I'm concerned. The Jewish law was given as a covenant with Jews, not with Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean there may not be some things in the Jewish law that might have application to Gentiles, even Christians now, but not in virtue of being in the Jewish contract. Just like there may be some truths of California law that have application in Illinois, but not in virtue of being in the California law, but because they're in the law, because they are broad-based moral principles that should apply to any state who has laws, like you shouldn't murder other people. So that's reflected in the California law and in the Illinois statutes as well. The biggest problem, though, is that regardless of how you understand the applicability of the Mosaic law at the time, the New Testament is the New Testament. It is the new covenant by contrast to the old covenant. The new covenant has been given because the old covenant has been broken. That's in Jeremiah 31 and following. And so God made a new covenant, which Jesus initiated and was formally and fully launched on Pentecost. And therefore, all the New Testament writers, insofar as they touch on the topic, make it clear that the Old Testament law is no longer a means by which anyone relates to God. And the book of Hebrews, to a large degree, was meant to herald that particular fact if it had been missed up until that point of history in the early church. This was a formal way of stating that we are under a new system. So if you claim that the Christian has to keep the Old Testament law in virtue of this argument from Psalms that the law is eternal, then you have set yourself up for a direct and violent contradiction with the teaching of the New Testament authors. If you want to live with that contradiction for the sake of saving your point from Psalms, then you're free to do that. You're welcome to that problem, but I would rather try to find another way out of this problem than doing violence to the testimony of the New Testament.